Well, very interesting article I saw in the Wall Street Journal today that is not the most rosy or, I guess, popular opinion. It's certainly not the kind of thing that you would expect to see in the mainstream financial press in America. However, I think that this less optimistic view, I people who are in the know seem to understand that this is kind of the future. The people like me, who have been very pessimistic for the last few years, aren't going to look so foolish here in the future. And so it's important to start conditioning the general public, or at least the general investing public, to the idea that things are not going to be so wonderful forever. This idea of synchronized global growth, in which stocks go straight up every year in a very tight channel with no pullbacks, that's just a fiction. In reality, what we've been living in for the last few years has been, a dream. Really, I would make the argument that the last 30 or 40 years have been a dream, the kind of thing that really can't be replicated, or at least something that is unsustainable. And now, after cheerleading this for so many years or decades in the case of some of these people, folks are starting to come around to the idea that perhaps, all of this, well, they're not regretting anything yet. They're not saying that this wasn't a good idea. They're just saying that, well, that time is going to come to an end here real soon. And that the era of growth in the U.S. economy really is coming to an end. And they're lamenting this as just sort of something that's happened everywhere else, and so it's going to happen here, like it's somewhat inevitable. His Wall Street Journal article puts a lot of the emphasis on the changing of the economy, and how well back in the 60s Fed stimulus was much more effectual because you had a higher percentage of the U.S. economy was taken up by interest rate sensitive industries like construction. And so therefore the economy received more of an artificial boost from a reduction in interest rates back then than they would now. And while that is an interesting statistic that the interest rate sensitive industries went from 20% down to 10%, that's just sort of nibbling around the edges as to why the Fed is going to become so impotent. In reality, the Fed never had any real power to make the economy stronger or to make the economy better. In fact, everything that the Fed has done has undermined the strength of the U.S. economy in exchange for short-term benefits. They have essentially manipulated the structure of prices in the economy to force so-called economic growth in terms of GDP, but in terms of the long-term health of the economy, something that's a little more qualitative, they have done nothing but damage. By artificially lowering interest rates, the Fed tricks people into making investments, into borrowing money that they otherwise would not have made or borrowed. But the side effect of this, of tricking people into do all this, is that the economy has built up a lot more debt than it otherwise would have. And that debt really can never be paid back. The Fed's game, essentially, is to trick people into borrowing more money than they can afford to pay back. The idea being that in the long run we're all dead, as John Maynard Keynes said, and so therefore, if we can just sort of keep the charade going on long enough, if the music keeps playing, well then it doesn't matter that there's not enough chairs for us all to sit down when the music eventually stops playing. And so past generations of Fed chairmen, most notably Alan Greenspan, have backed Jerome Powell into a corner. Jerome Powell is now backed into the same corner that Kuroda of Japan and Draghi of Europe were backed into. They're in a position where there is so much debt in the system that any increase in interest rates would lead to a catastrophic collapse. It would lead to a massive deleveraging, which would produce the greatest recessions of any of our lifetimes. Something that, frankly, I think would be unfathomable for the average person. And so therefore, ever raising interest rates as an option is completely off the table. But then again, we're already pretty much at zero, or darn near zero in the case of the Fed, and you can't really cut rates much beyond that. Japan and Europe have taught us that you really don't have the same effect when you're cutting from 0 to 1 to negative 5% as you do cutting from 5% to 0%. And so the Fed can't keep cutting forever and pretend like the zero lower bound has no meaning. The zero lower bound, in fact, does have meaning. And it's not, cutting from, like I said, from 10% to 5% is very different from cutting from negative 5% to negative 10%. At that point, they will have taken the charade far too long down its unsustainable path. Things will become too ridiculous for people at that point to really continue and to play along with the game. And so eventually, what you end up with is a place like Japan, where the central bank really is stuck in that corner, sitting right at 0%, unable to cut rates and unable to raise them, just sort of sitting back and watching as the debt-burdened economy lumbers along, just trying to stay breathing. Growth is impossible because there's so much debt weighing down the economy that people are way over-leveraged and they frankly just can't borrow much more. And so the only real option that they have on the table is stagnation. The only way that we're ever going to see real growth again is if we have a massive crash and all of this malinvestment is purged. If all of these bad debts are allowed to default and to go bankrupt. We would need to see all these zombie corporations go under and all of their employees find some new work. All the resources being soaked up and used towards unproductive ends would have to be reallocated through the market and through the price system to find a more profitable and more sustainable way of being utilized. And so what was this Wall Street Journal article's big push? What did they think was the solution to this? Because we really look like we've got dark days ahead. And they had a very, very boring assumption or proposition. And frankly, I thought, this article probably, it's way too woke. They're going to have to dumb it down and make this, mainstream media level somehow. And the way they did that was by proposing that, the government should just spend more money. Because, you see, that will boost GDP, and then everyone will be happy, right? Frankly, I don't even think I really need to get into why that's a dumb idea. Because anyone who thinks that, the proper response to deep structural problems in your economy, fundamental problems that, go back, that span decades now, anyone who just thinks throwing more fuel on the fire, just spending more money is the answer, frankly, is not really deserving of a response. But thankfully, they do at least point out that, the debt burden of not just the entire U.S. economy, but of, the U.S. federal government in particular, makes the federal government spending more money and just trying to use that to prop up the economy. They do point out that there might be a few problems in that plan. Of course, the federal debt is really, I would say, the biggest reason why the Fed can never raise interest rates. If the Fed raised interest rates, the federal government would default and probably collapse. The United States government is really the biggest zombie corporation in the world. Without these low interest rates, our $20 trillion debt now would sink us overnight. And the U.S. would fade away in a fashion reminiscent to its old rival, the Soviet Union, which suddenly just, disappeared one day. And it broke up into its constituent parts, and they all went their separate ways. And despite whatever problems they've had since then, I think that it's safe to say I'd rather live in one of the post-Soviet republics today than living in the old Soviet Union. And so I don't think the collapse necessarily is, the worst-case scenario. It might be the worst-case scenario if you're someone who works in Washington and you benefit from the current system and from the gravy train, and your job is paid for out of that $20 trillion debt. But I don't see any other path moving forward other than to just let all our fake economy, our fake political union, let all of this junk that's being propped up by debt, just let it all fade away. And then we can start over and try to have some hope for building a better future. Because for right now, it looks like, we are going to be the Japanese. We'll probably have, just as high suicide rates within 20 years. And so as we get closer to the end of this business cycle, I'm more and more interested to see at what point the Fed will be able to halt the crash once it begins. Because I think that the consensus is that the Fed is not going to allow any sizable recession. So whatever does end up happening will be despite the Fed. And so that's when we'll see just how powerful the Fed still is. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see folks back here tomorrow.